The song of the skylark is something that immediately transports me back to the battlefields of the Great War. When I walk the fields of my little South Yorkshire village and hear them singing in the blue sky above, my mind immediately is drawn to the fields around the village of Serre on the Somme, and those men from the Northern Pals battalions, men from this region, who walked into machine gun oblivion on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Welcome to the old front line with me, military historian Paul Reed. In this podcast, each week I give you a glimpse into the stories of the Great War, and we walk those battlefields together. So let's get our pack, put on our boots, and head out onto the old front line. We'll begin our walk outside Serre Road No. 1 Cemetery. The road that it's named after, the Serre Road, is today the D919, the main road that runs from the village of May, which in 1916 was behind the British lines, through the small village, now not much more than a hamlet, of Serre, and beyond that to Poisieux, and eventually to Arras. This was a road that had been used by soldiers over many, many centuries. Roman legionnaires had once marched along here from encampment to encampment in the conquest of Gaul. Napoleon's troops had come through here and marched along this road via Arras up to the coast for a possible invasion of Britain. In the Great War, the French army met the Germans very close to here in the opening phase of the war. The Battle of the Somme was fought here in 1916 and again in 1918. And in the Second World War, German panzers swept through here in the Blitzkrieg, and 4 years later, men from the Guards Armoured Division motored up this road, liberating the towns and villages in their wake following the invasion of France and the landings in Normandy. This really is part of the pathways of history, of all our history. But this week we've come to focus on events here on one day, principally one day in 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the 1st of July. But we'll also look at what happened here at the end of the Battle of the Somme in November, when the final attack took place. We'll go into the cemetery by going up the steps and through the rather large and imposing archway that forms the entrance to this cemetery. It's a cemetery designed by one of the lesser-known architects of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, Noel Ackroyd Roux. He was born in 1880 and followed in his father's footsteps in becoming an architect. He trained at the Slade School and at Regent Street Polytechnic, and when the Great War broke out, he was in Berkhamsted and joined the army, becoming a lieutenant in the Royal Engineers. Demobilised in 1919, he was recommended to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission by Sir Reginald Blomfield, who was one of the chief architects of the commission. In the end, he designed over 40 cemeteries, including this one here at Serre Road No. 1 and others right across the old Western Front battlefields. So while he's not as well known as Blomfield and Lutyens, he played an important role in the shaping and the design of cemeteries like this one. Coming through the archway, we'll walk up the grass path that takes us through the middle of the cemetery, and we'll see around us some of the nearly 2,500 graves that are in this cemetery. And we'll see just by scanning the rows that a vast majority of the men buried here are not identified. About 2/3 of the burials are unknowns. In some cases, a regiment is known. We can see a cap badge. In some cases, a rank, but the exact identity of these men could not be ascertained. And it is a concentration cemetery made after the war, when graves were not just brought in from the surrounding battlefields here, but eventually from all over the Somme area. So it represents a wide focus of battles and engagements on the Somme and different regiments that passed through here in 1916. The cemetery is arranged on different levels, and there are steps that take us from one level to another. As we walk up one set of steps, just to our right is a grave that is frequently visited in this cemetery. It is the grave of the Destrube brothers. Charles and Paul Destrube were two of three brothers, the third brother being George, who had joined up together in the 22nd Battalion Royal Fusiliers, the Kensingtons, in 1914. This battalion was a Pals battalion formed in London. All the original recruits of the unit were given a K prefix to their number to indicate they were original members of the battalion. And after training in London and then at Roffey in Sussex near Horsham, they went across to the Western Fronts and they served in northern France and around Vimy Ridge before coming down to the Somme. Their brother George had been shot by a sniper, and both brothers who were buried here went out into no man's land to rescue him, and he survived the war. They went on to fight in the Somme, in actions not far from here on the Redan Ridge towards the end of the Battle of the Somme, and they were killed on the same day in the forgotten end to the Somme, really, on the 17th of February 1917 in the fighting near Miramont. They were part of a Lewis machine gun team, and the brothers were killed side by side and buried together, and their grave moved here after the war. It's not known that if George, the brother who survived the war, ever came to visit this grave, but I'd like to think that he did. Walking to the very back of the cemetery near the Cross of Sacrifice were in Plot 1 the original burials of Serre Road No. 1 Cemetery. There's probably about a quarter of the total burials in this plot alone. But when we stand here, the thing that we noticed immediately is how close together the rows are and how every headstone is touching another. It seems it's like a long wall of headstones in this particular part of the cemetery. And that's because this burial plot was made after the Battle of the Somme. When the Germans withdrew to the Hindenburg Line in the spring of 1917, the battlefields were cleared, and all of the cemeteries that we'll see in this walk pretty much were made at that time. The men went out into the old no man's land and recovered the dead and reburied them here. So this is not quite a mass grave, but it is a collective grave with men buried in old shell holes and bits of trenches and on the battlefield itself. It represents the two ends of the Battle of the Somme in this area, the 1st of July 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. So when we look at the cap badges that we can see, the West Yorkshire Regiment, the York and Lancs, they're very much dominance from the Pals battalions that fought at Serre. And then we see a mix of cap badges from units that were here on the 13th of November 1916 at the end of the Battle of the Somme, when the final attack on Serre was made. Amongst the burials in this plot is the grave of Private Horace Isles of the Leeds Pals, the 15th West Yorkshire Regiment. He was killed at Serre on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, aged only 16, one of the many thousands of teenage Tommies that served in Kitchener's army during the Great War. He was probably born in 1899. He appears on the 1911 census when the family lived at Woodhouse in Leeds, aged 11. He's noted on there as being a newsboy delivering newspapers, but he later became a blacksmith's assistant. His father had served as a regular soldier before the war, and it is said that Horace had taken the tram in Leeds, and being a big lad for his age, he looked as if he should be of military age. He hadn't as yet joined up, of course, because he was underage, and somebody approached him on the tram and gave him a white feather. Confronted with this, he joined the Leeds Pals, and when he presented himself at the recruiting office, no one carried the sort of documents that we carried with us now. If you looked 18 and you said you were 18, you were in, and Horace was accepted. He did his training, he served in Egypt, and in the lead-up to the Battle of the Somme, he was wounded during an artillery bombardment and got some home leave back to Leeds following the recovery from his wounds. This would sadly be the last time that his family ever saw him. He returned to the front and was killed with his mates going over the top into the attack on Serre, probably in the opening moments of the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And I'll put some pictures of Horace, of his grave, and of the cemetery, Serre Road No. 1, on the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk. Returning to the roads, we'll turn left and walk up towards Serre itself. We'll pass a farm on the left-hand side, and anyone who has visited this area in recent times will have encountered the farmer that lives here. The farmer has a bit of an issue with people going up onto the battlefield at Serre, and it's not wise to drive up there or take any sort of vehicle up the track. It's always best to park at the cemetery and walk up and respect his privacy, respect the work that he does, and indeed respect the battlefields for what they are. They aren't a museum, they are places in which people live and work and carry out their lives, and we have to accept that. That's what these men in many respects fought and died for. He does drive rather rapidly up the tracks here, and it's always worth keeping an eye out for him, But if he stops you, normally he's pretty friendly and he's always engaged in conversation. So with that in mind, we'll turn left just past the farm. There's a big collection of cemetery signs here indicating the way we need to go, and we'll take that track and walk uphill. A gentle climb will take us up past the farm to the very crest just before we see the next cemetery and a fork in the track just ahead of us. And here we'll stop. We're standing very much in the centre of the Pals battlefield here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. The village of Serre is across to our right, and if we drop down slightly we can see the gently rising ground that leads up to the village of Serre itself. In front of us is Serre Road number 3 cemetery. We'll come to that later. Beyond that we can see a fork in the track with the left-hand fork dropping down the hill, the right hand moving towards the wooded area. And at the time of the First World War, what is today one long copse, one long wooded area, was in fact several copses: Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And we're standing very close to where Matthew Copse was now, just ahead of us. The British front line ran just to the left of the track that we're on now, swung round at the fork, down towards the wooded area that we see, ran slightly in front of it, and when it got to the end of the wooded area, it did a dogleg turn to the left, to the north, and went up towards the next village of Hebuturn on the northern part of the Somme. But before we examine the fighting here, who were these Pals? What were the Pals battalions? In 1914, the Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener, knew this would be a long and protracted conflict. So he called for 100,000 men to join the new army, or Kitchener's army as it quickly became known. By the end of the year, he had in fact recruited more than 1 million men. In many areas of Britain, in particular in the north of England, localised battalions were formed. The idea was these were men who knew each other, they'd grown up together, they lived in the same streets, they'd gone to the same schools, they'd played in the same games of football and cricket and rugby. They'd often gone on to work together, whether that was in a local factory or whether it was down the pit, the mines, which characterised that part of the north of England. And these were men who had a connection, a pride in the place that they came from. So why not capitalise on that and recruit men from those areas, promise them that they would not be split up, not just sent to any old battalion, that the men from Accrington or Barnsley or Bradford or Leeds would join up together, train together and serve together. But the only thing no one really contemplated was the ultimate outcome of this. If men serve together, go into battle together, sadly they can die together as well. And that's exactly what happened here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. So in 1914 and on into 1915, right across Britain, particularly in the north, Pals battalions were formed. And 12 of them came together to form the 31st Division, which was an all-Pals division. There were 3 brigades, one of them made up of 4 battalions of the East Yorkshire Regiment, recruited in Hull, the 10th, 11th, 12th and 13th East Yorks. Another brigade had the 15th West Yorks, recruited in Leeds, the Leeds Pals, the 16th and 18th West Yorks, the 1st and 2nd Bradford Pals, as well as the 18th Durham Line Infantry, the Durham Pals. And a 3rd brigade had the 11th East Lancashire Regiment, the Accrington Pals, the 12th York and Lancs, the Sheffield City Battalion, otherwise known as the Sheffield Pals, and the 13th and 14th Battalions of the York and Lancs, recruited in Barnsley, the 1st and 2nd Barnsley Pals. On top of that, the Divisional Pioneer Battalion was the 12th King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry, which was a miners' battalion. So together, these different units, 12 battalions of infantry and 1 battalion of pioneers, represented men from Accrington, Barnsley, Bradford, Leeds, Sheffield and Durham, as well as many other smaller communities right across the north of England. This was the true spirit of the Northern Pals, brought together in 1915, first sent to Egypt, where they defended the Suez Canal at the end of that year, and then sent in the spring of 1916 via Marseille to the Western Front. They initially took over the trenches in front of the village of Beaumont Hamel to get acclimatised to conditions on the Western Front, and then moved up to Serre in the months approaching the battle itself. The cemeteries just behind the lines here, for example, contain many graves of pals killed in that quiet period as these men were learning about trench warfare, raiding the enemy or the enemy was raiding them, as well as experiencing the daily bombardments of shells, of rifle grenades and trench mortars that characterise this part of the front. So when it came to the opening phase of the Battle of the Somme, these Pals battalions would form the northern shoulder of the Somme advance. There was fighting beyond here at Gommecourt, which we mentioned in a previous podcast, but that was considered a diversionary attack to draw attention away from the main Somme advance, of which this was the northern area. The objective of the Pals battalions in the attack here was to move forward from their positions along these copses, walk up that gradual slope towards the village of Serre, take Serre, push on to the ground beyond, and the idea was Bapaume by nightfall, Berlin by Christmas. This was the big push, the breakthrough, the battle that would potentially end the war. But the reality for these men from the north was very, very different indeed. When you look at the planning for this attack, it's quite clear that the divisional commander, the man in charge of the assaults, relied heavily on the power of the guns. Now, he wasn't alone in this. This was the biggest bombardment of the war, biggest British bombardment of the war. In the end, 1.75 million shells would be fired at the German line from Gommecourt in the north to Montauban in the south as part of the Somme preliminary bombardment. And with that level of shells being used against the German positions, it was believed that nothing could possibly survive. One of the phrases that many veterans that I spoke to often would relate was something that they'd been told in the lead up to this attack. They were told at battalion or company parades when discussing what the attack would be like that nothing would survive the bombardment, not even a rat. Nothing would survive the bombardment, not even a rat. And all they would simply have to do was to walk across no man's land, occupy the enemy positions beyond, and the advance would continue. At Serre, there was such a belief in this idea that the attack was not really seen as an attack, that the men of these Pals battalions were not moving forward to assault the German lines as such. They were moving forward to take over positions that really had already been destroyed, if not captured, by the power of the bombardment. So when they got there, they would need to dig in. They would need equipment and tools, barbed wire, sandbags, everything that was required to turn these positions into British trenches and thus ensure they could be held against any German counterattacks from units that might be in reserve beyond Serre towards Poisieux, for example. So the men were loaded up with all that gear. Every soldier carried a pick or a shovel down the back of his equipment. They carried extra ammunition. They carried extra Mills bombs. Some men carried extra Lewis gun or even Vickers gun ammunition for the machine guns. Some carried trench mortar bombs. Rolls of barbed wire were carried on wooden stakes. Barbed wire pickets were carried over the shoulders of some men. Sandbags were tucked in between webbing equipment. There was a popular contemporary cartoon that showed a soldier loaded up with gear like this, and the caption underneath said, "What are soldiers for? To hang things on." And that's what it must have felt like to the men who were here. Carrying all this equipment meant that their movements were restricted. With a pick or a shovel down the back of their equipment, it was not as easy to bend over to avoid incoming fire, whether from machine guns, rifles or shrapnel, and they could only move at a very slow pace. So when the men trained for this attack, their role was to leave their assault trenches, hold their rifle at the port, move forward through the grass, and it was thick grass here in the ground between the two sets of trenches, go steady at a walking pace, walk up that gradual slope, take the German trenches, push on to Serre, and push on beyond that. That was the plan. That was what was outlined. So what actually happened? At 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July 1916, the whistles blew, and the men of these Northern Pals battalions went over the top. Looking at the battlefield from north to south, from left to right, going forward towards the German trenches at Serre, the Barnsley Pals were on the left, then the Sheffield City Battalion, the Accrington Pals, and then the Leeds Pals. Coming up behind them were the next waves of more Barnsley Pals, men from the Bradford Battalions, and also the Durham Pals. This was the main body of the assault. The men walked forward out into no man's land, and they were met by withering fire. A lot more than rats had survived on the other side of no man's land, and the machine guns raked into these long lines of men moving forward at a walking pace. Most of them did not get more than tens of yards from their own parapet. Very few got even halfway across no man's land, and only a tiny proportion got into the German trenches. A group from the Accrington Pals under their commanding officer got in, bombed their way up a communication trench, beat off a German counter-attack with a Lewis machine gun, but were so few in number they were forced to withdraw. The majority just went forward, the first waves being mown down, the follow-up waves, and those are the men, I think, that had the most incredible bravery of seeing what had happened in front of them, stepping over the bodies of their comrades, knowing what fate would easily befall them, but yet they pressed on into that withering fire, and those proud battalions recruited in the north of England withered away. John Harris, who was a journalist in Sheffield and wrote a fictionalised account of the Sheffield City Battalion, summed them up. He said, 2 years in the making, 10 minutes in the destruction. That was our history. And it sums up the fate of these men here on that first day of the Battle of the Somme. Very, very quickly indeed, this attack broke down, with shocking casualties to some of the battalions, and absolutely nothing to show for it. By the end of the day, the Germans were still in possession of the high ground, of their trenches and of the village of Serre. The attack had been an utter failure, and along with it, the destruction of all of those battalions, those proud battalions, who had responded so quickly, so eagerly to the call of their country to serve, prepared to give their all, and this was their fate. Going in through the gates of Serre Road No. 3 Cemetery, we can see again that the headstones are very close together here, and the rows are compact. This is another of those cemeteries made in the post-Somme period, when this battlefield was cleared of the dead. It marks pretty much the high tide of the Leeds Pals advance here on the 1st of July, and when you look back across the cemetery to the other side of the track just beyond, just a few yards, you can see just how easily and quickly their fate was sealed. And if you look up at the cross of sacrifice and then follow it to the next cemetery you can see in the fields, and the one beyond that, you're looking straight down the middle of no man's land on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the place where these pals met their fate. Back in the 1980s and early 1990s, I interviewed a lot of men that took part in the attack on Serre. Two men always come to mind when I stand here and I look out across this battlefield. At the corner of the copses to the left is a little valley. The ground dips down, as does the track. And beyond that, at the time of the war, was the remains of the Touvent farm, a French farm complex that had been fought over by the French in 1915. Standing just to the left of that, on a bit of rising ground, were the signallers of the 11th East Lancs, the Accrington Pals, and among them a veteran I came to know, Russell Bradshaw. Russell was born in Accrington, the son of a local draper, but he retired to Sussex, and that's how I came to know him in the 1980s. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, he was on that slight rising ground just the other side of the valley, with a clear view across the battlefield. He was the rear link signallers. Their task was to work with the other signallers going forward with the main advance, and when they got to Serre, they would signal back that the objective had been achieved, and then Russell and his signallers would then signal back to battalion headquarters, and then beyond that to brigade headquarters at Lessigny Farm. But none of this happened. Instead, he had to stand there and watch the men of his battalion move forward into that grass and disappear into the machine gun fire coming from the German trenches. The men he'd grown up with, gone to school with, played with, drunk with, worked with, disappeared forever in front of his eyes. And every time he related that story, he always broke down. To think of a small community like Accrington and a man from that community to stand and watch its destruction, helpless to do anything to assist, we can only but imagine what that must have felt like. This was Russell's first battle, but not his last. He went on to fight at Arras in 1917, and in the Battle of Lys in April 1918, near Vieux-Bourquois, he was awarded the military medal for his bravery in the fighting in that sector. He lived a long life and a full one, and in those final years on the Sussex coast, his mind often returned to Accrington, and to those fields at Serre, and to the men that he'd known, who marched into that grass and never returned. So that was Russell. The other one I think of every time I stand here and look out across this ground is Reg Glenn. Reg was born in the city of Sheffield in 1893. His parents were amongst the growing middle class in the city. His father was a rates collector for the water board, and the young Reg was a well-educated and intelligent young man who joined first the Boys' Brigade and then the fledgling Boy Scout movement in the heyday of that golden Edwardian period before the Great War. He was working as a clerk in the council's education department when the war broke out, and he often said that when he joined the Sheffield City Battalion, it was comprised of 1,000 of the best sons of Sheffield and him. But he was an incredible man, Reg, and I was lucky to meet him through being a member of the Western Front Association in the 1980s, and then met him a few times out on the battlefields. My recordings of Reg have sadly perished, but I found this recording of him in the Imperial War Museum sound archives available on their website, and interestingly made available and digitised with help from the Western Front Association, a great project. I'll put a link to the full interview on the Old Frontline podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk, so you can listen to the whole thing. But this extract gives you a bit of a sense of the man and his memories of that first day of the Battle of the Somme. It's not a brilliant recording, but it's worth listening to.
Next morning came, we knew that we were going over at 7:30. My part was, there were 2 waves going over first, and I was in a little spot called John Cobb's, and it was a broken down trench, and I had to watch for these 2 waves to get over and get along towards Serre, and to get any signals that they sent back, either not by telephone, because they were being connected into the dugout there to the battalion headquarters. There wasn't room for me in. I was just in the open trench and watching out for these flag signals, which never came. The first wave was so badly bombed in the first trench that before the attack, they had to come out and lay down just in no man's land, because the Germans had got the exact range of the front trench, which was almost flattened, and that's where I was crouching in it. And so when the whistles blew for the first wave to go over, we'd been told, of course, that all the wire would be cut, everything would be an easy walk over, and so we were told to carry our rifles up what they called high port, up in the air like that, and to walk. And so the first wave set off to walk, and I saw them all lie down, and I thought something's wrong here, because they're not doing as we were instructed. But they didn't get up. And then the second wave followed them, and they did similarly. And I'll lay down, and then we realised that they were either dead or wounded, the majority of them. Just a few stragglers went walking on towards Serre, and eventually they dropped into shell holes and were being sniped at all the time.
Like Russell Bradshaw, Reg had been a signaller, and being slightly detached from the assault, this had saved his life. And like Russell, he had to see so many friends that he'd grown up with disappear into no man's land, never to return. Because he could play the piano, Reg later volunteered to help the Padre by playing his portable trench organ. And when the Battle of the Somme ended and the Germans withdrew to the Hindenburg Line, he came up to the grounds here at Serre with the Padre to come and find and bury the dead. They found many men still hanging on the German wire or lying in shell holes in the old no man's land. And that's when the cemeteries here were made. Serre number 3, where we are now, the Queen Cemetery we can see across the fields ahead of us, and then Luke Copse beyond. Reg told some harrowing tales of the burial of the dead at Serre, and one phrase I remember was that he didn't fear death as an old man, because in life he'd seen hell at Serre. Leaving the cemetery by the gates, we'll turn right and follow the track downhill towards the copses. As we come up alongside the area which is now the Sheffield Memorial Park, we'll turn right and take the grass path up the hill towards Queen Cemetery. As you walk up this path, you appreciate what a gentle rise, but still a rise this is. Imagine walking up here, not just in your full equipment, but all the other gear that you were required to make the attack, with the Germans on the skyline ahead of you and the guns blazing. It gives you a bit of an insight, as walking any battlefield does, to what it was like for the men here on the ground and the problems that they faced. The cemetery includes many men from the attack on the 1st of July, including men from the Accrington Pals, whose on line of advance this was, with the Sheffield City Battalion just being across to the left. And between here across the fields towards Luke Copse Cemetery was where the Barnsley Pals attacked on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. A devastating day for Barnsley, which saw hundreds of its sons cut down in these fields. That sacrifice in Barnsley was reimagined for the centenary of the Battle of the Somme with a fantastic installation, an art and light installation that lit up the faces, the photographs of the men who had fought for Barnsley and died in the Battle of the Somme. It was placed outside the magnificent town hall, and it was saved for a life beyond the centenary by placing it in a nearby park. And if you're ever in Barnsley, and who wouldn't want to come to our Barnsley, do take the time to seek it out. But again, standing here and looking across this ground, I think of another veteran that I knew, one that I've mentioned in the podcast before, Malcolm Vivian. He was a gunner officer in the 96th Siege Battery, Royal Garrison Artillery, and he was on the edge of the copses across to our left on the morning of the 13th of November 1916. It's often said that lightning doesn't strike in the same place twice, but here at Serre it did. One brigade of Pals from Hull, the 10th, 11th, 12th and 13th East Yorks, the Hull Commercials, the Hull Tradesmen's, the Hull Sportsmen's, and the odds and sods in the 13th Battalion called T'others. They'd survived the firestorm of the first day of the Somme, and at the end of the battle were put into attack across the same ground, but the conditions were very different. It was not a summer's day. It had rained, there was mud, and Malcolm remembered watching the infantry leave their assault trenches, try to wade through this mud as the machine guns began to play along the lines, the men trying to move across the battlefield, only to be cut down by those guns. Malcolm vowed that day, seeing the destruction of the Hull Pals, and the level of casualties were almost identical to the first day of the Battle of the Somme. He vowed that if he could ever prevent something like this from happening again, he would, which led to him rushing out in the midst of a bombardment and saving his guns in the attack at Lens, supporting the Canadians in 1917. In Luke Copse Cemetery, which we'll walk to now, are men from several different units, but quite a few from the Sheffield City Battalion. It's one long burial with the graves along the wall, There are brothers in here from Sheffield, and again it's a cemetery that was made when the Germans withdrew from here in 1917. And it's here and the other cemeteries that I think of Reg Glen and the Padre walking across this ground, finding fragments of men, but whose memories are now held here forevermore in the cemeteries of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. We'll go back on ourselves slightly and into the copses, into the Sheffield Memorial Park. This was ground purchased by the city of Sheffield after the war to mark a permanent memorial to the men of the city who had died on the Somme. But in the end it's helped commemorate all of the Pals that were here. There's a ruined brick wall commemorating the Accrington Pals, a fine stone to the Barnsley lads with the mining lamps and the symbol of the town on it, and there are plaques to many other units beside. As we walk amongst the trees we see the slight depressions of trenches and old shell holes, and there's a trench that runs directly in front of the Accrington Pals Memorial, which many think is a front-line trench from which the men attacked. It was one of the assembly trenches dug specially for the assault, so it was used that day, but the actual front line was beyond this trench, beyond the track, and in the field. It's quiet here at Serre, away from the busy routes of the frequently visited locations elsewhere on the Somme. We'll walk down to Railway Hollow Cemetery, named after the little railway line that ran up this valley, back to the headquarters at Lassigny Farm. And here, on the grave of Alf Goodlad of the Sheffield City Battalion, we can read that inscription: "The French are a grand nation worth fighting for." And here in these French fields, if we're lucky, high above us, we'll hear a skylark. And while Russell Bradshaw and Reg Glen never knowingly met, they both told me the same tale. Just before 0 hour, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, just before 7:30, as the guns lifted, just before the whistles blew, there was a moment of silence across the fields of the Somme. But not quite silence. In the skies above, they heard the larks. The larks were singing. And for the rest of their lives, whenever they heard the larks again, they were taken back to that morning at Serre, that summer's day on the Somme, when they witnessed hell. And I suppose I'm the legacy of those shared memories, because they passed that to me. So as I walk the fields of South Yorkshire, and I hear the skylarks high above Elsica, I too am transported back to the old front line. It's that part of the podcast where we look at an object connected to the Great War. And it's another postcard this week. I do love postcards from the Great War, particularly these pictures of soldiers. There's such a connection to the men of that generation. And this one is particularly haunting. It's a photograph of Sergeant Harry Scargill of the Barnsley Pals. I bought this in a junk shop in Eastbourne in the 1980s. And while out on the battlefields, I came across a gentleman called John Cooksey, who was in the process of writing a history of the Barnsley Pals. And thanks to him and his book, I found out a lot more about Harry Scargill. He was a draper who lived in Eldon Street in Barnsley, which is not far from where the railway station is. When he joined the Barnsley Pals in 1914, he took up an advert in the Barnsley Chronicle, the Chron, and delivered the following message to the people of the town who frequented his shop. And I quote from John Cooksey's book: "Having joined the Barnsley Battalion of Lord Kitchener's army, my business will be left in the hands of Miss Scargill during my absence, which I trust will only be for a short period. Customers can rely upon having the best attention, and I take this opportunity of thanking all patrons for past favours." But Harry never returned. He was killed in the opening moments of the first day of the Battle of the Somme, as the Barnsley Pals went over the top. He was buried in that little valley at the back of Railway Hollow, and then his grave was moved to Euston Road Cemetery in the 1920s. It's an amazing photograph. It stares out of you from the past, a link to the Barnsley Pals and the men who fought at Serre. But it also reminds me of the comradeship of those early days on the battlefields and meeting people like John Cooksey. John was always helpful, a true gentleman, and this week's podcast is dedicated to him because sadly John passed away in the last few weeks. the editor of the Western Front Association journal Stand 2, and the author of many fine books on the Great War beyond his first one on the Barnsley Pals. John will be missed on so many different levels, but his legacy lives on through the pages of his books and the ways he helped us to remember the generation that once walked the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. Do take time to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify or other podcast services. Tell us what you think using the hashtag OldFrontLine. Follow me on Twitter at Sommecorps and have a look at the podcast website www.oldfrontline.co.uk. I'll see you next week on the battlefields of the Great War.